instead of they could have run their campaign saying that the CDU led to a dependency on Russian cheap oil.
Yeah.
And they didn't do that. They didn't run a campaign saying those were the guys who were responsible for the shit that we have today.
Yeah.
They could have done that. They didn't do it.
Yeah.
They were afraid of the confrontation or to be playing the same game as the far right does.
Yeah, that was like, that particular issue was like a hard one because like, it's like, that's how the entire German economy has been running for like my entire life, basically. Like, I think if Germany, there was this kind of politics in Germany that if Germany was in control of things, and if Germany didn't have to like agree with American foreign policy, they probably would have left the Russian gas flowing. Plenty of countries get their gas from countries that are doing horrible things. This is the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
But like, America's in charge. So America was like, you need to cut yourself off from Russian gas. And that pissed off a lot of people on the far right, including some in the CDU, who do kind of believe in, I think Germans would call it like Ostpolitik, of like the politics of managing the East, basically. Because they also viewed like doing deals with Russia as this means of like containment and diplomacy. Because like Russia's having a hard time, like they're selling their gas now to like China and India, but China and India are hardballing them at the moment and like not willing to pay as much as like the Germans or Europe was willing to pay for, because on average, like Europe is much richer. But like, yeah, the Chinese also know like that Russia is kind of like in a weak position right now. We can kind of like decide the price of this gas.
Okay,
yeah. So yeah.
What I saw is that now Russia's trying to make some alliance with other countries. So they comes to NATO, but in his favor.
Yeah, so he's been trying that for a while. You have various attempts at that. CSTO, Commonwealth Strategic Treaty Organization, I want to say, which got like a lot of like former Soviet Union members to kind of like work in a similar kind of NATO organization. That's hit a hard blow now because one of their members, Armenia, has basically like all but officially left that organization because Russia was meant to be the defender of Armenia against Azerbaijan, but hasn't done that since Azerbaijan recently did like a huge ethnic cleansing campaign of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. If you want to know more, we did an episode on that in Corner Späti. But and as a consequence now, actually, France has actually kind of stepped in as this like the fifth nuclear power that everyone forgets about, has kind of stepped in as like the defender of Armenia. So like that's kind of falling apart. You also have like BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is like lots of people really like that idea, particularly for like anti-American reasons, which I'm totally sympathetic to, and then forget that India and China fucking hate each other, so that like that's never really going to work. They like have a bunch of territory that they both think is theirs. So like that's a complete pipe dream. And also like Russia is like not going to be a major player in that. Like,
I mean, I think recently Putin was in
North Korea. Yeah.
And then he has plans to go to Vietnam, I think.
Yeah, so Vietnam will be an interesting one because Vietnam, despite being a communist country, is also incredibly skeptical of like China for historical reasons, and thus as a country has a lot of like good relations with America. North Korea and South Korea are like, everyone's trying to be buddy-buddy with them, particularly with the Ukraine war, because it turns out the Ukraine war is actually very important that you have ammunition. Everyone was like, tanks are the best. Tanks are brilliant. And then like the Ukrainian army just buys like a drone from Amazon.com and sends a grenade at it. And it's like, well, shit, tanks are useless now. It's all about artillery. It's all about like guns and bullets. And it turns out the only two countries that have invested in that due to their stalemate is North and South Korea. So South Korea has been providing a lot of bullets to Ukraine. North Korea has provided a lot of bullets to Russia. So yeah, that was a fun one. This is about the EU election.
Yeah. So let's make a segue back to Europe and the conflict or the war or invasion from Russia to Ukraine has also been a factor for the voters to deciding to go more far right, as many of the far right parties are chanting on, why are we using our taxpayers' money to support that war?
That was an interesting dynamic that I was like, that was always going to happen. So a lot of center parties since like Reagan and Blair and Thatcher in like the US and UK have really wanted to like drill home this idea to a lot of the average voters that like a government budget is the same as a household budget, right? You have a limited amount of money. It would be like a household budget if your job was going to the money printer. If like you were controlled of like how much money you got, how much money was worth. So they've really drilled home this idea that there is a finite amount of budget, right? Like, oh, we have to like build more nukes. So that means you can't have like school meals for your children at school, right? There's always this kind of like balancing the budget reason. And it's always for why we can't have nice things. It's never like, oh shit, we can't defend Ukraine because we spent so much on lollipops for everyone. Damn. Like it's never that. Like, and this is where you get like Christian Lindner and his Black Zero and like we have to always never spend kind of thing, because he's also a really big believer in this idea of how economies should work. When really like, you can borrow. Germany was like, for a long time, you could have like paid Germany to borrow. They could have just like made money by borrowing.
Actually, money doesn't exist. Money exists only when you borrow it or something like that.
Yeah, like there's like much better people who could talk about this, but basically like it doesn't work like a household budget, right?
Yeah. I mean, it will work like that if you have a printer with money in your house.
Yeah. Or if like, like if you were in charge of, you're like self-employed and also in charge of like everyone else's job. Like it's absurd metaphor, but it's been for the last 50 years now, that has been kind of like the economic logic that we have been told. And you can't be surprised when you make all these really big announcements in the news of we're giving X billion amount of money to Ukraine, that people start making this connection that means we can't have nice things. It's not true, but everyone believes it, and it's your fault that they believe it, because you were using it for evil before, and now when you try to do something good, you fucked yourself. I was not expecting this backlash as quickly, especially not from the Eastern European countries. We saw, like, Poland, for example, was one of the biggest defenders of Ukraine. They share a border with Ukraine. Yeah. They have a very, very, very troubled history between those two countries that would not make them fast friends if you brought it up again, particularly during like the interwar and World War II period. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, at this moment, Poland was like a big defender of Ukraine and one of the countries that was always saying like, we cannot trust Russia, blah, blah, blah. Mm. And they felt very vindicated. But then as soon as Ukrainian grain, like one of the big things that Ukraine can do, it's on their flag, like the yellow on their flag is for grain. When that started flooding into European Union markets, particularly in the East, farmers got pissed off because it was undercutting their price. This has always been like a big elephant in the room of like, how do we get Ukraine to join the EU? Because there's like huge talks about that now. Mm-hmm. But like they are an agricultural powerhouse, and it will like destabilize the grain economies of other European countries.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, massively so, because it's like so cheap and they make so much of it. Yeah. They usually export that to Africa, actually. It usually goes to ports in Egypt, and then there it gets turned into bread, which then makes its own way to the rest of Africa. But yeah, so that's a whole thing there, and that caused the kind of like far right backlash in like Eastern European countries, namely like Poland, Slovakia, probably the one Lithuania or Latvia, can't quite remember, which I found very surprising. I was like, okay, this is something that could happen. I didn't think it would happen this quickly. So yeah, that's drawn some people to the far right. The far right and the center right were more willing to capitulate to the farmers' demands or like try and champion those movements and say we are the parliamentary representative of the street movement, which never really works. Farmers are kind of like do whatever they want. They usually lean right wing, but like whatever. And it's a little disheartening, and it wasn't handled very, very well. And this is me talking about Europe as a blanket, because Romania, for example, has a very different attitude towards Ukraine. They're more kind of, Romania on average usually leans more towards the like, we need to negotiate peace now. They're like way too scared of escalation occurring, again, because they border Ukraine, and also because of Moldova. Russia also has like a breakaway territory in Moldova. For anyone who doesn't know, Romania and Moldova speak the same language. Moldovans regularly go to Romania for work. Every Romanian who works in Bucharest has a Moldovan friend.